Charles was large, strong, and of lofty stature, though not disproportionately tall. His height is well known to have been 7 times the length of his foot. His appearance was always stately and dignified, and his whole carriage manly. He despised foreign clothes, however splendid, and wore the national costume of the Franks. This consisted of a linen shirt and linen breeches, and over these a tunic fringed with silk. Hose fastened by bands covered his lower limbs, and shoes his feet. Over all he flung a blue cloak, and he always wore a sword. In winter he added a coat of otter or marten skin. On great festivals he dressed magnificently in embroidered clothes and shoes bedecked with gems, and wore a diadem. But on other days his dress varied little from the common costume of wealthy Franks. He was an able, fearless general. He took frequent exercise on horseback and in hunting, and often practised swimming, in which he was such an adept that none could surpass him. Although slow to anger, few dared to meet his fiery glances when he was once aroused. He was temperate in eating and especially in drinking, but he complained that church fasts were injurious to his health. He was simple in his habits and loved his native German customs, but he realized that the Roman civilization was higher and better than the German in many respects, and he strove to borrow from it all that could be serviceable to the Franks. His energy was inexhaustible. He was a ready and fluent speaker both in his native tongue and in Latin, and he understood Greek. He tried to learn to write, but he began too late in life to succeed in accomplishing much more than his own signature. He was a zealous student, delighting especially in mathematics, astronomy, and theology. He established many schools in his kingdom, and took a keen interest in the progress of the students. His own children were carefully educated under the direction of Alcuin, and Charles often studied with them. Alcuin, born about 735, was educated at York, England, and became the most learned man of his time. He was persuaded by Charles to become the latter's teacher. Teacher and pupil lived in close friendship until Alcuin's death in 804. Back to main text. He gathered together at his court all the most learned men of the age, and sought their aid and instruction. He was active in reforming and enriching the church services, and paid special attention to the singing, which he often directed in person. Such is the description given of him by his contemporaries, and especially by Einhard, his secretary. It is to be noted that his most important work was the fusing of the best elements in the two civilizations, Roman and German. He did not copy indiscriminately, but he chose wisely the features of the Roman culture which seemed most desirable for his people. This course resulted in a profound influence upon the future of the Germans. In the preceding chapter, the intimate relations of the popes and the early Frankish kings have been mentioned. During the reign of Charles, the alliance became much closer. He had conquered the Lombards, and had given a part of their kingdom to the Pope. He insisted upon the adoption of Christianity by the Saxons whom he conquered. In his kingdom, in pursuance of his educational policy, he had done much to strengthen the Church, from whose officers he drew his teachers. He increased its wealth by commanding the payment of tithes by his subjects, and he himself set the example. When the people of Rome rebelled and the Pope was compelled to flee from the city, Charles put down the rebellion and gave the Pope protection. The grandeur of the Roman Empire still impressed the minds of men. The fourth empire in the prophecy of Daniel was believed to be the Roman, which was destined to endure till the end of the world. Although the capital had been transferred to Constantinople, and the empire had lost much of its territory, reverence for the imperial idea had never been lost. Men believed that there must be a Roman Empire, and could not conceive of the world without one. This idea was of great importance and influence throughout the Middle Ages. But the Greek Empire had lost prestige in the West, as its power was no longer felt. The Papacy wished to break away from connection with it, because it was heretical. Irene was now Empress of Constantinople. The Germans considered it unfitting that a woman should govern, and detested her for her crimes. Charles ruled almost all the territory in the West which formerly had been under the rule of Rome, besides much that had never been Roman. As the result of 50 or more military campaigns conducted under his direction, Charles had become the ruler of all the Germanic nations from the Baltic Sea on the north to the city of Rome on the south, from the Atlantic Ocean on the west to the Elbe and Saale on the east. He so largely increased the kingdom of the Franks, which was already great and strong when he received it from his father's hands, that more than double its former territory was added to it (Einhard). By these conquests Charles had become more than the king of any nation, or of any 2 or 3 nations. On the boundaries of his realm he was the nominal overlord of many races of barbarians. These, however, were never in subjection, except when overawed by a strong military force. Most of the kingdom actually under his sway was occupied by Germans, who were divided into many nations or tribes, differing from one another in language, laws, and customs. Some were civilized, while others were almost barbarous. Christianity was the state religion, but in many districts the precepts of Christianity were scarcely known and seldom, if ever, heeded. Among the Saxons, Charles found it necessary to forbid human sacrifices to the pagan divinities and the eating of the bodies of witches. This rule over men of many nations, occupying such widely extended territory, made a vivid impression on the minds of his subjects. In order to describe his power, even before he was crowned emperor, they referred to it as imperial. It seemed fitting that the king who ruled the imperial territory should be crowned emperor at the ancient capital. Consequently, on Christmas Day 800, as Charles knelt in prayer at the altar of old St. Peter's in Rome, the Pope suddenly placed upon his head the imperial crown, and the people shouted joyously, "To Charles, the most pious and august, crowned by God, the great and peace-loving emperor, be life and victory." Thus was the medieval empire founded, and Charles was the first of a long succession of emperors, which was to end only in the 19th century. But his contemporaries did not realize that there had been any new creation. They believed that the old Roman Empire was still in existence, and that Charles was the direct successor of Augustus, Trajan, and Constantine. Furthermore, in the opinion of his contemporaries, Charles had received additional importance and power by the coronation. There was to them only one emperor, and his dignity was far greater than that of any king. He was thought to be the head of the Christian Church in all secular matters, as the Pope was in all spiritual matters. As a matter of fact, this never was true. There were always Christian countries which were not included in the empire. Moreover, the title did not add any real power. Whatever power the emperor actually had was due to his position as king. The empire had no territory, no subjects, no army, no revenues, except as these were supplied by the territory, subjects, army, and revenues of the king who was crowned emperor. These facts must be borne in mind whenever the empire is studied. Yet Charles believed that he had received an increase of power and dignity when he became ruler of the Roman Empire. He required every one of his subjects over 12 years of age to take a new oath of obedience to him, and in this oath were included not merely the duties to the state, but also the duties to God. Leading a godly life, protection to widows and orphans, were enjoined in the same manner as military service or obedience to the game laws. Charles believed that as emperor He was the vice-regent of God on earth, and in his conscientious zeal confused entirely the duties of the state and the church. This confusion is characteristic of the whole medieval period. The machinery which Charles had for enforcing these orders, that is, the organization of the administrative system in his empire, was very different from that of any modern kingdom. First, there was no imperial taxation. Charles secured his income mainly from his private estates, which were merely large farms managed for his benefit. He gave much personal attention to the care of his property, and was watchful lest he might be defrauded of some of the grain grown, or some of the eggs which his hens laid. In fact, some writers, observing the attention which he gave to these matters, have styled him only a German farmer. In the second place, Charles expected and received gifts each year from most of his important officials. These gifts varied in character and amount, but their total value was great. In the third place, Charles exacted fines from his subjects when they were negligent in the performance of their duties, or when they were guilty of crimes. From these sources and from the spoils of war the imperial treasury was filled. On the other hand, the expenses for the empire were very small, if compared with those of a modern government. There was little or no expenditure for the army, for the police, for internal improvements, for courts of justice, or for education. All of these functions were left to local officials under the control of the central government, who received no salary from the treasury. The chief among these were the counts, who were generally chosen from the most powerful families resident throughout the empire. Sometimes the counts ruled over cities and the land adjacent. Sometimes they governed larger territories. The most important were those on the frontiers, who were called margraves. It was their especial duty to protect the empire from sudden invasions. Situated at a great distance from the centre of power, and required to be ready constantly to act on their own initiative, they were given necessarily a large amount of power and independence. The counts and margraves were expected to maintain order and administer justice in their territories. When an army was required, they levied the soldiers, saw that they were properly equipped, and led them to battle. In fact, the whole local administration of the government was practically in the hands of the counts. In order to maintain control over them and to centralize the government, Charles employed special agents who were called missi dominici, or imperial messengers. These were sent out each year to the various districts of the empire. It was their duty to correct the mistakes in the local administration, to hear appeals from the judgment of the counts or margraves, to make known special laws enacted by the emperor, and in general to represent his authority. Usually 2 missi were sent out together in order that one might serve as a check upon the other, and their districts were changed every year in order to prevent collusion with the local counts. Ordinarily one of the missi was a layman, and the other a bishop or abbot. The leading members of the clergy played an important part in the government. They held large properties, and over these they exercised the same powers that the counts had over land not held by the Church. The position of the Church as a whole will be treated in the following chapter. Here it is essential to note only the share it had in the government. The abbots and bishops administered justice, raised the troops, and acted in every way as imperial officials. This tended still more to increase the confusion between the religious duties and the political duties, which has been noted already. That Charles had united Western Europe and brought the nations together into a Christian state had been due mainly to the strength of his own personal character. His subjects respected and feared him. They admired his bravery and dreaded his anger. He was devoted to the service of the Church, but he ruled its members with a firm hand and made them aid in the imperial administration. By the force of his personality he controlled all the discordant elements in the state, and founded the medieval empire. After his death, the empire was not strong enough to make the union permanent. It soon split up into separate kingdoms, but the memory of it was one of the cohesive forces for the future. Where so much power was entrusted to the counts and the missi, it was certain to be abused whenever the emperor's eye could be eluded. Einhard says that the missi were frequently dishonest. It was to their interest to connive at the misdeeds of the counts. The latter were almost independent in their own counties, and used their great opportunities for their own profit. There was much friction between the lay officials and the rulers of the church. It was a period of lawlessness and barbarism. Each of the separate nations forming the empire had its own laws, customs, and dialect. They felt little interest in the empire, and were held in check only by the fear of Charles, or by the need of his protection from their barbarian neighbors. The Franks, who were the immediate subjects of Charles and formed his greatest strengths, were being destroyed by the wars which had lasted for so many years. As many were either killed or wounded, and others ruined, throughout the empire it was more and more difficult to obtain men for the army. But of all the Germans, it was the Franks who suffered the most, and as there was no interval of peace, their strength and numbers gradually became exhausted. The great extent of the empire made government difficult. The roads were extremely bad, and travelling was dangerous, as robbers lurked in the woods. It is well to remember that Western Europe was very sparsely settled, that there were no railroads, no steamboats, and no telegraph. The roads and bridges which the Romans had made were being destroyed by the lapse of time, and the subjects of Charles did not know how to make new ones equally good. All travel by land had to be on horseback, or in carts, or on foot. On the water, rowing or towing was the usual method. As men did not know how to tack, sails were of no use except in going before the wind. The greatest danger to the empire, however, and the real cause of its disintegration, was the German habit of dividing the father's kingdom among all the sons. When there were several sons, each one was given his share. A kingdom was treated just like the estate of a wealthy man, and was parcelled out so that each son should have an equal or nearly equal portion. At Pippin's death, the kingdom had been divided between Charles and his brother. They were not in harmony, but the brother's early death prevented the kingdom from being weakened. Charles planned to divide his empire among his 3 sons. In this case, disunion was delayed because 2 of the sons died before the death of Charles. The full effect of this bad policy of division was seen in the reign of his son. Louis, called the Pious because of his devotion to the Church, succeeded Charles in 814, but was not equal to the task of ruling the empire. He was not a great warrior, nor was he admired and feared by his subjects as his father had been. Yet his greatest troubles arose from following in his father's footsteps by dividing the empire among his sons. In 817 he arranged the portions which each one of his 3 sons should have as a kingdom after his own death. The eldest, Lothar, was to have the lion's share, and was made co-emperor with his father. Soon after this division the Empress died. Louis fell into a fit of despondency, and talked of abdicating in order to spend the rest of his life as a monk. His advisers and subjects were alarmed, as they feared that his sons were too young to rule. At first they tried in vain to shake his determination. Then they planned to make him marry again. As the king showed no interest and would not choose a wife, his advisers gathered together all the fairest maidens among the nobility and brought them before the emperor. The beautiful Judith caught his fancy and became his queen. They had one son, who was known later as Charles the Bald. Judith soon acquired great influence over the emperor and used it to procure a kingdom for her son. In 829, when the boy was 7 years old, Louis was persuaded to make a new division, taking away a portion of Lothar's share and giving it to Charles. All the older sons were angry and fearful that their father, in his partiality for Charles, would give him still more. From this time they were almost constantly in revolt, and at war with their father or with one another. The fortune of war shifted from one side to the other, and each time a new division of the empire was made. Finally, Louis the Pious died in 840, leaving the imperial crown to Lothar and a kingdom to each of his surviving sons. There were only 3 kingdoms, as one of the sons, Pippin, had died in 838, and the part intended for him had been added to the territory of Charles the Bald. After the death of his father, Louis the Pious, Lothar tried to secure the whole empire. In 841 he gave battle to the allied forces of his brothers, Louis the German and Charles the Bald. The latter were victorious, and Lothar suffered a decisive defeat. This battle determined the fate of the empire. The German principle of division, which had been frustrated so often by fate, had triumphed, and the lands ruled by Charles the Great were now divided into 3 separate kingdoms. The brothers, however, still felt the need of union against Lothar. In 842, Louis and Charles met at Strasbourg and took an oath to continue their alliance. This oath has been preserved and is of a special interest because each took the oath in the language spoken by the subjects of the other. Louis used the following language: Pro Deo amore pro Christian poblo e nostro commun salvament, disti in avant, in con Deus savire podir me donat. Si salveraio, cist meon fradere Carlo, et in da duedua, et in cadueda cosa, si cum perdrait son fradera salvardist, in o quid il mi altresi facet, et ab luter nul plaid numquam priandrai, qui meon volcist, meon fradere Carle in damno sit. Then Charles repeated the same oath in the German language. In Godes mina, entonces Christianes volcas, und unser bederer, geant nisi, fontesimo dage frad mordes, so framso mir Gott gewisti indi, mad furgebit, so haldi tessan minan bruder, so man mit rectus sinan bruher sal, in din das or mich so sama, duo indi mit luderin in non hainu, in nege gango, in minan willam imois escanden werhen. Footnote. Out of love for God and for the good of the Christian people and our own salvation, I will in future, from this day forth, as far as God gives to me wisdom and power, treat this my brother as one ought to treat his brother, on the condition that he does the same by me. And with Lothar I will not willingly enter into any agreement which may injure this my brother. Back to main text. These are the earliest specimens which have been preserved of the Romance and Germanic languages. It is clear that the 2 people could not understand each other, and it is interesting to note that only one word has practically the same form in the 2 oaths. In the following year, the 3 brothers met and agreed to the Treaty of Verdun. By this treaty, Louis the German received lands inhabited almost entirely by German tribes. The possessions on the west of the Rhine were said to have been given to him so that he might have some places which would furnish him with a supply of wine. The kingdom of Charles was inhabited mainly by the descendants of the Romanized Gauls. Lothar, however, had a long and comparatively narrow strip extending from Aachen to Rome, inhabited by men of different races. In their arrangements for the division of their family property, the sons of Lewis had taken no account of the physical geography. The kingdom of Lothair had no natural boundaries, and was exposed to invasion on all its frontiers. The two capitals were situated at the northern and southern extremities. It was possible for the kingdom of Lewis to develop into Germany, and for the kingdom of Charles to develop into France. The empire of Lothair was destined to have no national unity, and to be a bone of contention for more than 1,000 years. From this time the fortunes of the Frankish empire declined. Its territories were divided and subdivided. The real heirs of Charles the Great were the dukes, counts, and bishops, who became more independent as the Carolingian rulers became weaker. For in each of the kingdoms the ruler was intent upon increasing his territory, or upon securing the imperial title. In order to gain the support of his subjects for his ambitious plans, he was obliged to make constant concessions of lands and powers, until he was left almost without resources for maintaining the empty titles of king and emperor.